Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Cooper Cole podcast, where we delve into the practices of Canadian and international artists in conjunction with their exhibitions at our gallery. This podcast emerged from our YouTube channel, which we developed in 2020. My name is Magdalyn Asimakis, and I'm the Director of Research and Artist Relations at Cooper Cole, a contemporary art gallery in Toronto, Canada, that was founded in 2012. This episode features a conversation between myself and the Vancouver-born, New York-based artist Fin Simonetti. Fin works in sculpture and stained glass. Her work examines the entangled relationship between measures of control and desires for security. Fin uses imagery that is designed to tap into our visceral fears and conceptually moves between rendering sculptural forms that represent both protection and vulnerability. Fin received her BFA from the Ontario College of Art and Design in 2009. She's exhibited internationally at museums and galleries such as the Esker Foundation in Calgary, Matthew Brown in Los Angeles, Company Gallery in New York, Interstate Projects in Brooklyn, and MoMA PS1 in New York, among others. Her work has been reviewed in Art Forum, the New York Times, Art in America, the New Yorker, Cultured Magazine, and Canadian Art. Fin is also a musician and will this year be releasing her second album through Hausu Mountain in Chicago. For her current exhibition at Cooper Cole entitled Our Denomination, Fin has created a series of adult-sized pacifiers or soothers out of various stones. The handles are made of lock shackles, some open and some closed, and some cut. The works are meticulously placed on a set of bleachers, which acts as both a plinth and a part of the installation. On the three wall works framing the bleachers hang three round wall works made of stone, lock shackles, glass, and found barbershop posters. These are called the rose window works because they reference rose windows in ecclesiastical Gothic cathedrals. We are recording this interview in conjunction with this exhibition currently on view at Cooper Cole in our West Gallery until April 16th, 2022. Thanks for joining us and welcome, Fin.
Hi.
How are you today?
I'm good, thanks.
There's so much to unpack with these works, but maybe the best place to start is to speak about the objects themselves. You work with really difficult materials, predominantly stone and stained glass. So can you tell us a bit about, how you came to working with these materials and the process of making these works? I'm also interested in the selection of stone as well, because you've used stones from, different countries and chosen them very specifically. So maybe you can get into that a little bit as well.
Yeah. So generally, like you said, I do stained glass and stone are reoccurring materials that I work in, but I try not to ever limit myself based on materials. I sort of feel like whatever the idea, whatever material the idea needs to live in is sort of what dictates. But then there's certain things ideas that I'm interested in that are really communicate well through stone or through glass in particular. But yeah, I always just like to caveat that whatever I feel like working in, I give myself permission to do that. And I think that's like a healthy thing as an artist. So for stained glass, my dad's family are Italian immigrants. They were all born in Italy and they came here. I was born in Canada. I live in New York, so not here. My dad's family, a lot of them worked in glass and in stained glass, as a trade in Italy, and they brought that over with them and continued to work in that material. Sort of, yes, artistically, but mostly as a trade more than anything, a decorative trade. And so I apprenticed under my uncle, who's a stained glass craftsman. And having not grown up with my dad's family and being estranged from my dad and that side of the family, and their culture, stained glass was sort of an entry point into connecting with that side of my family, the heritage culture, through this material. And that definitely has informed the work I make in stained glass. Not all of it, but I think we'll get into some of the themes that reoccur in my work, and some of that does come out of my relationship to religion, because a lot of my dad's side of the family, they're, like traditional Roman Catholic Italian. Their glasswork is predominantly for cathedrals and churches. It's very like ecclesiastical. It's very specific aesthetic. And then again, like I was raised separate from that family and culture. So yeah, anyways, I'll come back into that. But so that's sort of glass. And then stone, I'm self-taught as a stone carver.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
It is, but it's also, I feel like, I don't know, it's just very intuitive. Like it's the entry-level tools are pretty rudimentary. Like it's a hammer and a chisel. Like it's the same tools that have been used forever. It's sort of the most basic thing. Like you hit the hammer and the chisel and you point the chisel at the part you want to disappear, or chip away at. And like I do use
presumably you have to understand the stones so well so that you don't fracture it or make some kind of quick mistake.
Yeah. And I definitely make a lot of mistakes, and it's like a learning process. But I feel like in terms of being a self-taught thing, like you can kind of, well, I don't know, I found that I was sort of able to figure it out. And I do now also use all types of contemporary tools, and like angle grinders, sawzall, orbital sander, all types of things that I mix with the traditional tools, because there's things that the traditional hand tools do better than whatever power tools. So yeah, I now use a mix. So yeah, how I got into stone. So again, more family history. So my dad carved stone recreationally, I guess you would say, like as an artist. And throughout my dad's family also, there's a lot of stone carving, but not as a trade, more as whatever, they're Italian, they just like carve stone. And my dad died in 2016, and as an only child, like it was my job to clean his house and get his affairs in order. Okay. And his house was just like filled with all his stone carvings that he'd made, and lots of stained glass too. But I'd sort of had it in the back of my head for a while that I wanted to work in stone, and then cleaning out his house and sort of spending a lot of time with his stuff and his work sort of gave me a sense of urgency about carving stone. And I think, and he was also self-taught as a stone carver. And so I think like through the process of grieving, I use like teaching myself to carve stone as like a way to grieve, which also informed certainly like the first couple of years of my stone carving in terms of like the content I made.
So did you start using stone after that, after encountering?
Yeah. About like 4 months. So he died in November, and I'd say like January, February, I went and got a piece of stone and was like, okay, let's try this.
Wow.
And I feel like it just felt pretty intuitive. And then I'm kind of hooked on it. Like I was saying earlier, like I don't marry myself to any particular material, which may be surprising to people. That like I feel like there's articles about me that are like the stone carver is like the right. Like or like artist like works in stained glass, and these like very and yeah, I love those materials right now, but yeah, no promises.
Yeah, well, and you said that the materials like the stained glass and the stone lend themselves to the themes that you explore in your work.
Totally.
What do you mean by that?
So I mean a lot of different ways, like both conceptually and like viscerally. Like, so I mean I'll go into a bunch of different themes that I'm reoccur, but like one, for example, feeling that's like my most coveted feeling, or has been for a long time, is the feeling of precarity. And stone and glass both really naturally have those qualities, just because they're fragile, or there's ways to really turn up the heat on that feeling of precarity. So I've found like, yeah, there's something there. And then with stone in particular, I just think that like, so if I think of any of the objects that I've carved in stone, like if I think of them in bronze or cast or plastic or resin or clay, even, like it doesn't have that same aura. I mean, that's like such a traditional like notion in art history, like the aura of a painting or something. But I really do feel like glass and stone have that type of aura that, yeah. And
well, it obviously connects to your context, right? Like in terms of your familial history and I don't know, there's something to be said for that, I think, because it speaks to your particular experience and your sort of access as well. So that I'm sure that plays into it, but I think the precarity also of the material is such a good point.
yeah. Yeah, and there's like ways of staging material that turns up the sense of tension as well. Like I never used plinth, so I always use like some type of utilitarian public armature is what I think, is how I think of it. Like the railings are a reoccurring thing, or the bleachers. And like with the railings in particular, like if the sculpture is larger than the railing, like if the base of it is wider, then you can sort of increase that feeling of like if anybody breathes, it'll break. Like this sort of feeling of extreme tension. And like the bear traps, stained glass bear trap pieces have that also, like, and they really are that fragile. Like, it's not a,
it's not a real bear trap.
Yeah, like it really, yeah. And there is a lot of, I mean, people always love to hear like, oh, do you break your work a lot? It's like, yes, I do. Yes. Yeah, they're natural materials.
So. Yeah, absolutely. And so actually maybe I'll ask you, I was going to ask you more about the exhibition to start, but maybe we'll continue on this trajectory, because I your broader work. So I'm interested also in your controls, or your interest in between measures of control, views versus desires for security. And like you've said before, that your work meditates on how desires for protection and safety can actually manifest in acts of exclusion or segregation or harm. And what is interesting about that is that you said your work sits at the precarious line between the body threatened and the body that's threatening. So it's never, so you always have this feeling of being unsettled, right? You're not sort of sitting in one of those experiences. You're constantly feeling a little bit tense or something. And I think that that's sort of plays into what you're saying about, your works on the utilitarian objects that you use as plinths. It does feel like if you just bump it, there will be disaster,
Yeah, the like slippage between control and security is, yeah, like a reoccurring area of interest for me. Like for the show at Cooper Cole that's up right now, our Denomination, for example, one of the main sort of themes of that show is, or themes is a silly word, but things that I was interested in is the notion of in-group, and how, because coping mechanisms in general are sort of a reoccurring interest of mine, and like the ways that those are formed and the implications of them. And I started to think about how the idea of being on the inside or outside of an in-group is itself a coping mechanism. So like your religious affiliation or your, racial in-group, however you identify that, or your team, or political affiliation or nationality. Like there's all these layers of borders that we draw around ourselves to insulate ourselves. And so seeing the sort of double edge of that, of like, it's a protective, it's a security sort of, like it's like a mental security blanket that like, this is my group and like we identify together. And the sort of idea of like group think that comes with that. But then the flip side of that being like, I think that's, I mean, not to go extreme, but that's like how genocide is perpetrated. Like,
Yeah. And
the insider, outsider, like that violence is most easily committed against those that you think of as outside of your in-group.
And is that why you included the bleachers as a plinth?
Yeah, so the bleachers, I was really thinking of them as like a metaphor for, yeah, a public in-group that you can like, that's sort of like a permeable barrier. Like you sit on this side of the stadium, like it's very, like you voluntarily join it and collectively identify like we're on this team. And then with the staging of the exhibition for Cooper Cole, I sort of had it set like a church. So the bleachers sort of look like pews in terms of their orientation to the wall works.
Yeah,
So
I do wonder that, especially because it's like as soon as you walk into the space, it's facing you. So there's something a bit even confronting about it.
Yeah, yeah. I just sort of visually like pews and bleachers, like there's obviously a similarity. And they're both like, yeah, like publicly self-selecting in groups that you can be a part of. And yeah, so, and sports are like weirdly an ongoing fascination of mine, and it in terms of sort of the psychology of how we think about sports and like what it means culturally, even though it's very alien to me.
Yeah.
Like it's not like my like hobby interest or something, but
well, and you've said, kind of coming off of that, you've said that mise en scène is very important to you when creating an exhibition, and you were really involved in the spatial aspect of it, of our denomination. So so it's interesting to hear some insight into how you approached that installation and how everything was placed. And yeah, maybe you can speak a bit more about that, or even the placement of the pacifiers on the bleacher as well.
Yeah. So yeah, I always approach a solo show sort of, I think of them like cinematically, in the sense of it being like a contained world that has its own like logic and bracketed narrative in a way. I think previously I've talked about how I stage exhibitions sort of like, or think about the work in an exhibition like an essay or a poem. Like it's not just a collection of recent work put together. I really give a lot of thought into, yeah, this like cinematically contained world. That, and there's overlap from one to the other, from one show to the other, but yeah, I think I mean, I have a bit of a film background. I did 2 years at York in film, which is funny because I'm not, like, I don't like movies, and I'm like the only person in the world who doesn't
like movies.
Yeah, it's very alien. I'm not trying to be an edgelord. I just like don't have the attention span. But but like I feel like the thing that I did absorb some methodologies from film school that I carry with me, and that being one of them, and thinking about, yeah, an exhibition as staging a set. And I'm very interested in the architecture of a space. And I guess that comes in with the railings as a reoccurring thing that I use as a way to sort of control the viewer's movement through the space.
So the rose window works in the exhibition, you have 3, and they reference rose windows in ecclesiastical Gothic architecture. But then except in your works where like what would be the tracery is actually much thicker and heavier, and in place of saints or apostles, you've found images of men from barbershops or barbershop posters. Yeah, can you speak a bit about the concept behind these works and how you brought them together?
Yeah. So these works sort of came out of some reading I was doing into Gothic architecture, and I think because of my work in stained glass, like ecclesiastical imagery is pretty present in my sort of studio mood board,
Mhm.
in my sort of mental landscape. And so with the rose window pieces, they sort of came through experimentation. And the thinking about churches as sort of a site that cue like deep internal processes that then like communion with sort of like metaphysical ideas of like death and the afterlife and people of the past. And I have this recurring sort of sentiment in my work that like religion as an entry point into magical thinking.
Mhm.
And with that, I'm thinking about how it's like the most normative way in which we enter into those ideas. If that makes sense.
Yeah, and like I guess a physical space that allows you to enter into that.
Yeah, like the church itself being a place that like cues, like this is, you know, um, like I'm thinking of my dad's family in particular, who, they're sort of practical people and all, but then they go to church and they talk to the dead, and it's this physical space where when you cross that threshold, um, it's just sort of a different mindset. And yeah.
And it's like and does that connect with, I mean, I know you don't have we have another work at the gallery that's not part of the show, but it's like you think about contact, like physical contact between the body, for instance, like touching an object for blessing or for good luck. You sort of will sometimes polish areas to insinuate a touch,
Totally.
that connect with the
Yeah.
site.
Yeah. I think you're referring to a shovel sculpture that I did that had I selectively did a high polish.
Yeah.
So when you do high polish on stone, the surface, like it literally looks like glass or it looks wet. It's
Mhm.
really amazing. And there's no like varnish or anything on that. That's just from polishing.
Because it
And
looks like it makes it okay for me to touch it, even though I know I
yeah,
can't.
you're allowed to. um, yeah. So there's sculptures um, in usually in ecclesiastical settings where there'll be one portion of the sculpture that's highly polished from people touching it for good luck, and there's this sort of like ritual. Yeah,
And there's also like an aspect to in terms of like thinking of a church of sanctuary, right? Which probably plays into your work more broadly in terms of security or protection.
totally. Yeah, that really comes up in the stained glass doghouse pieces.
Mhm.
So I have a series. They're like oversized dog. I mean, it's like this a doghouse for like a Great Dane. They're pretty big.
Yeah.
And there's sort of a mix between a church and a doghouse. And the stained glass pattern usually has a fence in it.
Mhm.
So again, thinking about borders and enclosures, and yeah, that sort of slippage between like sanctuary and subjugation.
Mm.
That when you're containing something, um, you're invariably keeping something out. That yeah, and the sort of potential like violence of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so is that, I assume that's where the title Our Denomination came from. Is that sort of what you were thinking about?
Yeah. Well, yeah. So with the interest in groups and their sort of utility socially, our denomination, yeah, being like a self-selecting in group,
Mm-hmm.
And by saying our denomination, like I'm saying claiming it as mine and yours and not
Yeah.
other people's, is sort of there's like a comfort in that.
Mhm.
Um
A
yeah,
safety or something.
yeah,
Mhm.
yeah.
And the include so I want to talk more about that because you've used found barbershop posters before.
Mhm.
So I'm curious about that, like what drew you to using those as a material, and you know what it means to sort of put them in the sort of I don't know what you would call the areas that you cut out in the rose
I
window.
call them cutouts.
Oh,
Yeah.
cutouts,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, barbershop posters, I've always sort of been drawn to them as images. And I think earlier I was talking about how I came into carving stone after my dad died.
Mhm.
And so I grew up basically without a dad, and then my dad died. So it was like this double loss, or like this double
Mhm.
two stages of like alienation from a parental or paternal figure.
Mhm.
And in working through that personally made me sort of interested in um, alienation in relationship to masculinity, um, and and for some reason that the barbershop posters really felt like the perfect vehicle for that. So they're these sort of stock images of men, um, that they're personal images because they're portraits, but they're also not meant to be. Uh, they're utilitarian, like they're just really showing off a haircut style.
Mhm.
So there's this sort of mix between these, those two things, and um, most barbershop posters, like out in the real world, which are the ones that all the posters they use are sourced from actual locations. They get faded in the sun and they turn that sort of soft blue.
Mhm.
And there's sort of just a feeling of obsolescence or not, like neglect in those images, like viscerally to me. And also, I think like male barbershops are a space like for men. And so for me, as you know, like that's not a space where there's anything for me in the, like I feel
Mhm.
very much like an outsider looking in, and it sort of emotionally rhymed with the feeling of alienation that I was personally feeling. And then I think also there's sort of the thing I was saying about them being like portraits of people, which should be really personal, but then they're kind of stock images. There's that mix of like
Yeah.
personal portrait slash stock image, and the way that they're repeated, like there's the same posters are found all over the place. um there's this sort of like emptiness to them. And so the first
And-
big show I did after my dad died was Pledge at Company,
Mhm.
and that show was basically about masculinity, and not in a sort of like quippy like toxic masculinity, like that's not interesting to me.
Yeah.
But sort of like actually addressing like what I perceive as pain, like male pain in the culture, and male alienation in the culture, like both myself personally, or by myself personally, but also just like observing around me, like the sort of shitty options for like contemporary masculinity that are available, and like how it's just, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, there's definitely like a sense of alienation in the works, in the photographs, I guess, because it feels strange calling them portraits, but just in the fact that they've been sort of physically neglected, but also the fact that the men are mostly all like looking away. None of them are looking outward. They're looking away because they're trying to show their haircut, but
They all sort of, they often have like a very sad expression, which is
yeah.
just sort of, which is I think one of the things that, like before working with these materials, like I would always just stare at these images and like wonder about these people, and just
Mhm.
as like an object that exists socially. Like they're very peculiar, but they're also very banal.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
And
I
it's
think there's
a contrast with material contrast with being framed with this like very beautiful stone and stained glass, and that's very intricately carved, and yet they fit perfectly in those spaces.
yeah, I think that, yeah, that's definitely something that draws me to them, is like using a ready-made object that's kind of trashed. Sort of the way it contrasts with the sort of like high art aura of stone and glass. I just think like they really communicate well together in their like disparate aura.
Yeah.
You say that. And just to, as like a aside of like how I collect the posters, because I think it's kind of funny, is so originally when I figured out that I wanted to work with these posters, and I knew I wanted them to be the actual posters from the places, not prints or something like that. I tried to go and buy them directly, and it was not successful. People were like, what are you doing? Get out of here. So then what I realized is
why?
that
Because you had to be like a business, or
no, just like didn't understand why someone coming off the street wants to buy a poster off the wall. I think just people were pretty, it just like was a very socially uncomfortable interaction that didn't ever end with me being able to like purchase the
poster.
And
you meant you went into barbershops and asked them.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And it was just, yeah, and it didn't go well. So then I realized that what I could do is, because there's, like I said, maybe 20 posters in circulation in the US. I mean, I'm sure every country has their like own whatever. There's like
and
yeah. So what I would do is I would find the poster that I wanted out in the real world. Like, so I'm passing a barbershop, I see, okay, they've got the one that I want. It's like the right color from like the right level of fade. So then I would go online to this barbershop distributor, buy the new poster, and then go in with the new poster and say, can I trade you this new one for, for this old one? And they always say yes.
Yeah.
And then if they ask what the deal is, my line is that I'm a set decorator and that I'm doing a scene in a barbershop and I need faded looking posters.
Yeah, I mean that's the way to do it. I think it makes it a little more salient than explaining you're putting it into a rose window, but not a real rose window.
Yeah. I mean, it's not like legible.
No.
And yeah. So I found that that's really worked, and it's like sort of like a funny part of my practice is like this little song and dance to get these posters.
Yeah, I mean it's win-win in that case.
Yeah, and then they get the new, and then it's funny because there's a barbershop sort of near our studio that I say, sorry, my studio. I say our studio because my partner Michael and I are both in the same studio. Near the studio that we go to, and I've traded out a poster for them. I've done this sort of swap. And then a couple years later, I traded it again. Like I traded up the one that I'd traded them because it had faded in the 2 years. And they were like still doing sets. And I was like, yeah.
See you in another 2 years.
Yeah, very normal.
Okay, let's talk about the pacifiers. So these are sculptures. They are life-size pacifiers if they were made for adults, so they're larger than a baby pacifier. And you know, similar to the rose windows, you did them in various stones. So there's a very obvious contrast from the softness of a baby pacifier, and I definitely get a visceral response looking at them and just imagining them breaking my teeth. And this sense of moving between, you know, protection and vulnerability as a theme really comes up, I think, in these sculptures. Yeah, I was wondering if you could describe the concept behind them a little bit, you know, formally, but also psychologically.
Yeah. So yeah, it was really important to me that they were life size for an adult to sort of get that feeling of like you want to put it in your mouth and the impossibility of the object. And just in terms of previous work that I think this ties in with, like for Pledge at Company, I did some stone earplugs that were life size. And
Mhm.
again, that sort of, you know, if you plugged a hole with this object, it would be detrimental, like this sort of impossible object. Yeah. Um, all of the material for the pacifiers is scrap. And actually, all the same with the rose windows for the show. This entire show was made with scrap stone.
Oh, wow.
Um, yeah, like the wall works are all offcuts from like countertops, basically.
Okay.
So I go to the stone yard where they like dump the materials. You still have to pay for it,
Yeah.
but it's extremely discounted.
Okay.
Um,
Interesting.
yeah, and actually like the pink rose window, so it's split down the middle, and that I mean I'm very happy with that, and that choice is going to be something that I reuse. But that was originally just because it was in two parts, and I really liked the color of that stone.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And it was just that I didn't have enough to make a full rose window, so then I had to sort of solve that by making this sort of rupture in the middle.
Hmm.
Um,
But that's sort of, I mean, I love that. I think it's one of the most, it's a really interesting aspect of the work.
totally. Yeah, I mean, it was a like a I feel like sometimes limitations in your materials are, I mean, it's what makes you think creatively
Hmm.
and find solutions that you wouldn't otherwise come to.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, and same thing with all of the pacifiers being with scrap stone, that formed a sort of limitation also of, what colors I used, how I paired them. And of course, there's way more scraps available than I use. Like I was still making very deliberate color choices.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah. Um, and so the bases of the pacifiers, they sort of, there's sort of two poles of how, sorry, I'm visually doing a thing with my hands. Like on one side, there's pacifiers that look, my pacifier sculptures that look literally like pacifiers, and they're pretty sort of verbatim objects. And then on the
Yeah.
other side, they get very abstracted, and the base of the pacifier looks like a quatrefoil or a trifoil that is the same size and dimensions as the cutouts from the rose windows. So there's
Mhm.
a rhyming between the pacifiers and the rose windows, and this sort of idea that they're either plugged into the holes in the tracery or they're pulled out of. And with the black rose window in particular, um, the passive or the quatrefoils and trifoils that are put in are, there's chipping around them. So there's this sort of, I think narratively, this idea of smashed, like
Yeah.
that the shapes are like smashed into it.
Yeah, I really get that sense. It feels like there was a lot of force and like sort of slamming them into the rose window.
Yeah. Yeah. The chipping sort of like gives like an indexical action mark. Like this is
Hmm.
where this movement happened. And again, that's like thinking about the limitations of the material dictating the direction that the work goes. Like
Yeah.
because stone chips, because that's, I mean, when you chisel it, it has like a chipped, aesthetically, it has that texture to it.
Hmm.
That made me think of bringing that into the work sort of literally as
Yeah.
yeah.
And the sort of handle, I guess, if you would call it that, of the
Mhm.
pacifier is like a padlock shackle.
Right. Yeah. And in terms of thinking, so the reason for that being like again the theme of security,
Hmm.
and the pacifier is the security, the self-soothing object, um, and the lock. I mean, locks and lock shackles have been sort of a reoccurring image or idea in my work, and this sort of, I mean, yes, security, but also as a demarcation of private property that you see in public. So a bike that's locked up, or a business, or a gate. And with my mind frame in terms of my work, like thinking about that demarcation as kind of a violent act.
Yeah.
You know, with keeping politics out of it, but like that, you know, a gate that's shut, that's, for example, like there's a park, and I've talked about this before. There's a park in Manhattan. It's just like north of Union Square, and it's so beautiful. It has beautiful flowers and benches and trees, walkways, and it's gated.
The private one.
It's private. Yeah, it's a private park, and if you live in the real estate around the park, you have a key that lets you into the park.
Yeah, it's wild.
It's really wild.
Yeah,
it's so wild, and it's, I mean, there's like homeless people around. It's a super expensive area, so the only people that have it are these rich people that live in these apartment buildings, and then like on the sidewalk right outside of it, there's homeless people, and there's garbage, and there's rats.
And there's a real world, like
there's a real world, and it's this. So the lock on that gate in particular, I feel like sort of signifies my, like, aside from the security thing, that the thing where I was saying like public-private property delineation, like that is, and the potential violence of that. And that's not even political. I mean,
boundaries, you know, and just
really,
like there is that, you know, what you were saying of like in group, like that's so like, what is the better example of that, of just like turning so inwards and so private with people who are, you know, quote unquote like you.
Totally.
And then but some of them are in your sculptures, some of them are cut and open, and like some of them are even like, you know, attached to the rose windows, like you really just inserted them. It appears that way.
So it was important for me in both the pacifiers and the rose windows to have the locks in various states, like locked, unlocked, and cut. And I think that the cut lock is just sort of, to me, like signals the fallibility of that boundary. Like it's not like a lock is sort of a placeholder. And if I'm thinking of a lock as a metaphor for security or this delineation of public-private, like these are sort of like socially agreed upon boundaries. They're not, you know, they're socially constructed. And in that there are permeable and fallible, and showing the lock that's been cracked, I think sort of signals that the protection is really only a placeholder. And like, so for example, in previous works of mine, I've used like home security stickers. And I think that does the same thing of like, you're signaling safety, but it's really more so a placeholder. Like, for example, for those pieces with the stickers, I ordered them online. And so you can just buy them online and put them in your window, and it does the thing.
Not have a security system.
Not have this, right? Like it's about signaling versus the real, like. And I think that points to how these things are socially constructed.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's you know, I think when I think of the pacifier as well, I guess, and you know, that we also sometimes call them soothers, you know, this idea of soothing a sort of crying or anxiety or, you know, discomfort, you know, is also like to silence a baby, you know, to silence, or in the case of your sculptures, to silence an adult. You know, whether that's a, you know, politically motivated or otherwise, is not my point, but just in terms of yeah, this idea of signaling, putting something as a placeholder for actual comfort.
Right. Yeah, like the baby cries when it's hungry or it wants its mother, and this sort of, yeah,
It holds it off.
yeah, it delays and
Yeah,
um
exactly.
yeah, and also I think with the installation for our denomination, like the crowd that is implied by bleachers would be like a noisy, like there'd be a sound associated with that, and then
True.
the pacifier being like a silencer. There's sort of like I think a joke in there about like uh
Oh yeah, totally.
yeah, like the silencing object on the like noisy, in the
Yeah.
noisy context, and this sort of contrast.
Yeah,
um
absolutely.
and I also think that some of the pacifiers look like butt plugs. So again, like there, I swear to God, there's, as like dark and like serious as my work generally is, there's, I promise there's a ton of humor in it.
There is humor, yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
And I think that's like one of the places is like these, because there's like a sliding scale of like how realistic they look as pacifiers versus these abstracted objects versus butt plugs. Within that sliding scale, there's kind of like a humor of like which hole do I plug with this, you know? uh, um,
Yeah, so you sit
yeah.
down on the bleachers and then you have to figure out how to use the pacifier.
Yeah, there's like a psychosexual joke in there about like
Totally. Yeah.
which hole gets plugged.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, well, yeah, and that's sort of like sitting in between, definitions is like it sort of goes back to what we were saying earlier about just precarity and sort of sitting on a line between something. And I remember one time you said that your work negates escapism and that it doesn't, seek to define a resolution as much as you want to sort of question the possibility of true sanctuary or true protection. And there's always this sort of, as a result, a sort of oscillation that occurs between understandings of sanctuary or security or any sort of vulnerability. And I don't know, I'm curious to hear you say a little bit about that.
Yeah, I feel like pretty steadfast in not ever having like a like a putting forth like a resolved version of the world or of the work, or having, and that's either in not allowing there to be a single reading, so letting the objects be slippery conceptually and visually. And I, that's, I think, pretty reflective of a realistic worldview. Also, just,
Yeah.
the sort of movement of signs and ideology and just, yeah.
Yeah, and
Not,
in so many ways, right? On the one hand, just in terms of the way different information can be conveyed through various channels, essentially there being different truths around, in a manner of speaking, but also just in terms of art, I think that we've, not to be too art history, but art history has taught us that when this symbolizes this and that means this and that's the story.
yeah,
And that there's no like it's this or that, there's no in between.
yeah,
And I think that moving, sort of resisting that in work is very hard because we're still sort of trained to think that way, even though contemporary art is very different. But I think, sort of being in between definitions or in between sort of understandings is a very difficult but powerful place to be.
yeah. I think we're like pretty comfortable with, yeah, it's like a postmodern reading of like, there's not like a didactic reading of anything. Yeah, it's fun, like, I mean, I don't get asked this anymore, thank God, but I used to get asked a lot, like if my work was feminist. And it's just
Right.
like the most inane question to me because like I don't know. Like as far as like activism goes in art objects, I mean, yes, there are artists that work in those veins, and I think and I like that work and think it's cool, but I'm definitely not in working in a channel of like trying to communicate a thesis.
Right.
I'm just way more interested in just like making mucky signs.
Yeah. um Agreed. Well, I'm gonna ask a last question that I
Yes.
like to ask. What are you reading these days? Are there any like text or audio that contributed to your thinking with our denomination?
Um, so for our denomination, my during the making of the show, so over the winter, my partner Michael and I were reading the new David Graeber book. Um, I think it's called like The Dawn of Civilization. I like literally cannot remember the name of the book. I
Okay.
think that's what it's called. Um, anyways, it's like a history of early humans basically and social organizations, sort of social organization within like early human civilizations.
Cool.
Um, and it's fabulous. I highly recommend it. And um, I didn't mean to read it in relation to my work. I was sort of interested in that time period generally. But it made me think about how archaeology sort of fits into my work. Um, I mean, which is always kind of a quiet theme, or theme is a stupid word, but yeah, like like
It's fine.
when you work in stone, like you think about deep time
Yeah.
because of how stone is made, where it comes from. Like you end up thinking about excavation and yeah, just the time scale of those materials. I mean, it's not plastic, you know, or
Mhm.
even yeah. Um, and so reading that book and thinking about early humans and archaeology sort of made me think a little bit more about how to push that aesthetically in the work of it, which I don't think happened yet in our denomination. Like I'm still chewing on that. But maybe the one place where it started to creep up is in the black rose window with the stamped out quatrefoils and trifoils. There's this sort of, I think it points a little bit towards a, a physical excavation.
Mm.
Um, and previously, I've done a series of shovels, and those works are very much about like burial versus excavation. I won't go too far into it, but that's just to say that, you know, this is something that's sort of been on the sidelines for a while. And reading that book made me think about ways to bring that into the work and how it relates to the materials I'm working with.
Mhm.
Um, I just finished the series by N.K. Jameson. It's the Broken Earth series. It's sci-fi. It wasn't great. I did read all 3 books, so it's weird for me to say it wasn't great. I obviously enjoyed it enough to read like the whole series.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know. I read a lot, so it's my
That's
like.
great. No, it's such a good point about archaeology. I guess it is natural to think about that when you're working with these super old materials that
Yeah,
developed over time. It's hard to avoid thinking about that.
yeah.
Yeah, I guess
It's
that's fair.
really insane. It's really, really crazy. Like stone is it's basically a core sample,
Hmm.
you know, like literally you're carving a core sample. And just the variation in terms of color and texture in different parts of the world, it's really
Yeah, because you've used stones from different parts of Europe and the States, and they all look so different.
so different.
Yeah.
Yeah, like calcite, for example, is the orange stone that I'm obsessed with. It's only mined in Utah,
Hmm.
and the color comes from like crushed bugs.
That yellowy one.
Yeah.
Oh wow. Yeah, that one is so incredible. I can't believe it's
Yeah.
natural.
I know there's so many stones that I like. I really lose my mind about.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And then just the like act of excavating it from like deep within the earth,
Mhm.
I don't know, there's a lot there. And stone is, I mean, it's all millions and millions of years old. It's made through extreme heat and pressure. I mean, marble is the process of how marble is created is wild, just in terms of the temperature and the pressure that's required to produce it.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, it's really cool.
Well, I think, yeah, archaeology and stones, maybe that's our next talk together.
Yeah, I think so.
To be continued. All right. Well, thanks so much, Finn. It was great to hear about this work, and hopefully everyone listening can see it in person and see the stones in person. But if not, we have this podcast. So
And we have the computer.
yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so
Sure.
much.
Okay. Have a great day.
You too.
Bye.